When you study naval history, and specifically capital ship sinkings, a few come immediately to mind: Arizona, Bismarck, Hood, and the Japanese super battleships. Yet, when you move to the Mediterranean, you probably find the most important of them all. Not because it had any notable impact on the conflict, but because this sinking shows the way to the future. The first capital ship lost to guided weaponry, a sign of things to come, even if it would be many years before the technology matured. That ship was Roma, one of Italy's most powerful battleships, and the bomb that sank her was a Fritz X, one of Germany's guided bombs. Roma was a victim of evolving technology, yet another system that would, after it matured, render gunboats obsolescent. Let's look at that sinking now. I have previously covered this as part of my larger Roma video, which I'll link in the description. This time we'll focus entirely on the sinking. To begin, it's important to understand the situation the Italian Navy found itself in. By 1943, it had suffered several serious defeats. Cape Matapan and following engagements had gutted the heavy cruiser force. Taranto had caused lasting damage to the battle fleet, including taking Cavour out of the war entirely. Not to mention resources, from steel to oil, were in scarce supply. Ships like Impero or Aguila were never completed because of the resource shortages. And even the complete ships rarely sortied because there simply wasn't the fuel to do so. By 1943, the fancy new battleships only had fuel for emergencies, not enough to sail out to contest the British to any real extent. So they remained in port for most of that year, until the landings in mainland Italy forced their hand. The Italians had to contest those landings, and made plans to do so, until the armistice interrupted those ideas. With the Italian armistice effective on September 8, 1943, the main battle fleet set sail on September 9th. Initially planned to be used as a last-ditch defense, the ships now sailed to surrender and hopefully survive the war out of enemy hands. It was just the enemy was now Germany, and the Germans weren't inclined to just let them go. While the Italians would have preferred internment, the Germans wanted the ships sunk, or taken for themselves, but that was less likely. In any event, the Italian fleet sailed for Sardinia. This group was built around the Littorio-class battleships. Littorio herself, by now renamed to Italia, Vittorio Veneto, and, of course, Roma. Those ships sailed to Sardinia because there was confusion on exactly how to surrender the fleet, as well as a plan to transfer the Italian king to Sardinia. The king, as it would turn out, fled in a different direction, and Germany had already occupied the port the fleet was sailing for. Instead, the Italians turned for Allied territory, to join the rest of the fleet, which had sailed for Malta, at least the ships capable of sailing by this point of the war. Unfortunately for the Italians, the Germans spotted them first, and, not being dumb, realized exactly what the Italians were trying to pull. The Luftwaffe promptly sent out bombers armed with the Fritz X radio-guided bomb, a very early example of a guided munition, a fairly primitive one requiring constant line of sight, and radio adjustments by the bombardier all the way in. This required the bomber to fly straight and level. It also required a smoke flare on the tail of the bomb to help the bombardier keep track. This did little to dull the effectiveness of the weapon, as we'll see here. The German planes caught up with the Italian fleet fairly quickly, although the Italians didn't open fire when they did. There was some level of confusion on what planes were trailing the fleet and who they belonged to, because of how far away the Germans were flying. The Italian admiral, it seems, believed them to be Allied air cover at first. He would be proven fatally and tragically wrong. Once it became apparent these were German bombers, and they were beginning an attack run, the Italian fleet opened fire. Unfortunately, the Germans were flying too high and far away. So high and far, in fact, that the Italians couldn't understand it. It was a terrible position and angle for level bombing. Then the Italians realized the bombs were guided, and confusion turned to horror. One landed to the stern of Italia, jamming her rudder. While her crew worked to fix that, messages went back and forth between the battleships. Reports that the bomb was guided by the bomber, which remained above the fleet, seemingly steering it in. This first attack came at 3:30 p.m. and did relatively little damage. It was just a precursor of what was to come a few minutes later. At around 3:45, a second attack came through, this time aimed directly for Roma. 2 bombs would hit the ship. The first hit on the starboard side, between 2 of her 90mm guns. The bomb punched through Roma's armored deck as if it wasn't there, before blasting through her normal deck as well. This Fritz X ended up slicing through the ship entirely, exploding beneath Roma's keel. This was a common thing with Fritz X's. They often over-penetrated the target. In any case, Roma's boiler rooms, 5, 6, 7, and 8, were destroyed and instantly flooded. The same went for the aft engine room, the combination of which disabled her inboard propellers and dropped the ship's speed to 12 knots. Electrical failings, temporary as they may have been thanks to heroic efforts by her electricians, also occurred here. This alone would have been crippling damage. Survivable, perhaps, but crippling in the same way that warspites run in would later prove. Had Roma escaped, the ship would probably have never been repaired, between the Allies not caring and the Italians not having the ability. Warspite, after all, was never fully repaired from her own run-in with a Fritz X. Roma would turn out to not even be that lucky. At 3:52, a second Fritz X hit Roma on the port side between her bridge and the super-firing forward turret. This bomb, like the first, punched through all her armored decks. Unlike the first, it detonated inside Roma's hull, most likely inside her forward engine room, if the rush of steam from her hull before the killing explosion is any indication. It's hard to know for sure. Regardless of where exactly that bomb detonated, the results would prove catastrophic. The magazine of Roma's Turret 1, the foremost one, blew first. This explosion was devastating all on its own, especially as much of her damage control equipment had already been damaged or outright destroyed by the first hit. It was the following detonation of her number 2 turret's magazine that sealed Roma's fate. This explosion threw the turret, which weighed about as much as a mid-sized destroyer, specifically 1,600 tons, into the sky, where it fell alongside the ship and sank like a stone. Just imagine for a moment the explosive force necessary to do that and what it would do to a ship's hull. On the bottom today, we might be able to see that turret. Alternatively, this is turret 1 or 3 after falling out of its mounting. Unsurprisingly, this explosion caused extreme fires all across her bow, while also destroying the forward superstructure, and killing everyone, including the admiral in charge of the fleet, instantly. By 4:12, Roma was already sinking. By 4:15, on September 9th, 1943, she had capsized and broken to, taking 1,253 of her crew down with her, or alternatively, 1,393. The numbers vary between sources. Regardless, Roma's sinking was catastrophic and a sign of things to come with guided munitions. While no other bombing by a Fritz X was quite so successful, the Germans still did further damage. This sinking, in more ways than one, pointed the way towards the future. And yet, I don't consider this a reflection of any flaws in Roma's design. Just about any battleship would sink were they hit in the same way, with their magazines going up with enough force to throw turrets into the sky. That Roma remained afloat as long as she did is a testament to her designers and the efforts of her crew. Moreover, Italia would suffer a direct hit later on in her own right. Exact same ship design, exact same weapon. But because this bomb punched clean through and exploded alongside, it didn't sink Italia. Roma, similarly, might have survived if not for the second bomb hitting in the worst possible location. In any event, this brings us to the end of the video. Roma's wreck was located in June of 2012. I've also covered this, and will link that in the description as well. The short version, Roma's wreck is broken, buried in the mud, and torn into multiple pieces. The stern shows 2 distinct breaks, and is inverted on the bottom. The bow is much the same, and much of the superstructure has ended up on its own. It's not a pretty sight, although an expected one with the devastation of her sinking. Even so, it's good that we know her final resting place, Roma's grave, and those of the men killed aboard her. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.